The following is my attempt to put into words and concepts an experience I had long ago, which was in fact merely the first I can recall out of many similar experiences that would follow, and which would eventually seem to blend together into one experiential flow. If this seems particularly sad or pessimistic or resigned, that's because it's also an attempt to characterize the aesthetic as seen through the lenses of despair or depression. However, I suppose it could also be seen as the loss of a certain conceptual philosophical grounding for the deeper appreciation of the beautiful. My goal isn't to say that all hope of the beautiful is lost, and to that effect I do plan on following this up in another installment with some thoughts on how it can be found again. I call this the abyss, losing the beautiful, or the window. I was standing next to the large window. Though taller than I, it was merely the bottom left of 9 sections that made up the front of the large room. The whole front of the room was one large window, except for the wooden cross beams that separated the sections of glass. The room was 25 feet high where one side of the angled ceiling met the other. I was all alone in a conspicuously voluminous house, with no other presence than my own to occupy its space, and no other space than mine to be filled with the presence of its space. I looked out into the distance. The wide view stretched up to 50 miles away. Nearer, the browns, grays, and greens of individual rocks and trees were discernible. In the intermediate space, the multiplanar uniform patches of shadowy darker greens and grays characterized the scene. In the far distance, it was the hazier, lighter, and subtler grays and blues of the broad shapes of the mountains themselves and the sky itself. As I looked at all this, at what was before me, I was struck with a deep sense of staleness in the scene. But it wasn't the staleness of fatigue, of the banal, for my look had all the intention and the focus of an active and interested gaze. Somehow, though, it was a gaze in which the sensible scene itself was almost passive and superfluous. It became abundantly, definitively, and painfully clear that the rocks, the trees, the mountains, the greens, grays, and blues stretching before me were not the true objects of its captivation. If not the images, what, then, was it that spurred my gaze on? From what wellspring did its waters emanate that the scene would comprise but the surface? What was its true object? The scene was the same one I had looked upon many times, but now I realized suddenly and heavily, with the force of what might be called a melancholic epiphany, that the novel, anguishing staleness derived from a shattering of what I had long taken as its essence. Even so, I wanted a longer, closer look. I lingered at the window in these contemplations. Where before I had always tacitly, uncritically, and innocently imagined that it inhered in the objects of the scene itself, beauty, or what I had thought of as beauty, now stood revealed as a facade, as an objectless phantom. Where I had long considered that the underlying essence of what appeared beautiful was the beautiful in itself, that it flowed as a true and authentic disclosure from its wellspring, and where I had thought naively that I was seeing it, that I was its witness, it was now exposed as a trivial accident, a mere contingent illusion of the mechanical corporeal entities that belied it, and to which it was utterly unessential and parasitic. It became relegated to the dubious confines of a relationship. No, worse yet, at best a mere half-relationship between unreceptive, unconscious corporeality and a knower whose very existence was itself always a tenuous, unnecessary, minuscule, unessential proposition to begin with, a kind of pseudo-phenomenon without object and with a skeptical, cynical, jaded subject. Where before I had found affirmation and inspiration, now I discovered at the level of the affects and the psyche a convenient, palliative, self-serving, self-deceiving construction. Consequently, furthermore, I now conceived beauty socially and culturally as the nominal, hollow inheritance of blind custom. The experience was made the more distressing, doubly so, by the very fact of the scene's nominal beauty, by the fact that something so horrifying could wear the empty mask of aesthetic magnetism. Perhaps it was this very doubled, reinforced, and masked character of its horror that drew me to it so compellingly in its deconstruction of the aesthetic in a way that could not be paralleled by pondering the likes of the ugly or of man-made edifices and contraptions. Indeed, the moment would have been made less distressing, or even perhaps consoling to a degree, if consolation were ever to be had in such a revelation, or at least it would have been made more logical, more coherent, if the scene had been one of charred, blackened, foliage-purged, smoldering trees upon a smoldering, blackened, and charred ground. It would have been more truthful, more authentic, more real, if the intermediate space had been inhabited instead by grays and blacks, the far distance by broad, lighter gray shapes, and by a grayish, crimson sky. What, then, was the object of my gaze? I leave it to the listener to identify and characterize this. The experience was a one-way realization, an irrevocable transformation. Since then, I don't know that I've ever looked at beauty the same. What had been novel would become an ossified comportment, and the lingering at the window would effectively last a lifetime. Beauty, if I were ever to find it again, would have to be remade from the ground up.